Today I want to take a look at how these global economic forces have actually ramped up in power since the 1990s, and we're going to be taking particularly a look at what are called international financial institutions, or IFIs, and the increasing power they have over sovereign nations, even sovereign nations as powerful as the United States. In modern times, that is since World War II, the World Bank is probably one of the global institutions that has had the most impact on Indigenous peoples around the world. Its goal has been to industrially develop so-called third world countries, and as a direct result, Indigenous peoples and their lands have been targeted through loans from the World Bank. So let's take a closer look at what the World Bank does and how it functions, what its goals are, and what its effects have been on Indigenous peoples, Indigenous lands, and the so-called third world in general. In a really amazing book called Paradigm Wars, Indigenous Peoples' Resistance to Globalization, Victor Menotti writes that some leaders of national Indigenous movements are starting to understand that to truly resolve the environmental issues that Indigenous peoples are facing, we must address global forces beyond the borders of the nation states in which we live. So we talked about how there's that phrase out there, think globally, act locally, and that's a great phrase. It makes you feel very empowered because you do things locally, and it's a great thing to do. But we also have to keep in mind that when we say think globally, we don't just mean thinking globally in terms of how all our collective local actions will have an impact globally. We have to also think literally globally and act globally in cases, because there are these global economic forces that are at work that are actually having impacts through every layer of our existence. And if we ignore those global forces, we're kind of, we ignore it to our peril kind of idea. So these global forces have developed into something that we refer to as economic globalization. There's different forms of globalization that we talk about out there, but this is about economic globalization, bringing the whole world together into one global economy. And as we shall see, there are different international financial institutions that are helping to determine how that global economy functions and how it works. This global economy started to really take shape after World War II, as the nations of Europe in particular were gathering together to recover from a very terrible, horrible war, another terrible, horrible war, millions and millions of people killed. I think that if I recall correctly, the Soviet Union had something like just over 20 million people alone that died during World War II. And of course, we had just horrendous loss of life. I'm sorry to even keep on going on with this. It appalls me. I can't believe that we have millions of people die, and yet we still don't seem to learn how to step back from that brink of war. But yeah, so it's been almost 100 years since that last World War II, and I hope people have not forgotten the horrors that World War II and World War I brought about. It was so horrific. People decided, we need to get together and we need to start having these global conferences and global discussions with each other. And that's where you had things like the League of Nations, United Nations, coming out of these world wars where people said, we can't do this again, right? This just exacts such a horrendous cost of lives. We can't do this again. But it also exacted terrible economic costs. And so in order to try to pull out of this, people met in 1947. Many of the nations met here in the United States at what was called the Bretton Woods Conference, and they set up the beginnings of some of our international financial institutions that are very powerful today. Things like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Post-World War II, when they met there at Bretton Woods, they also developed or came up with an agreement called GATT, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which was a voluntary agreement between the nations who signed onto it that said, yes, they would agree to, not favor one nation over another, or not try, to kind of have a equalized trade between nations. But this was a voluntary thing, and people could or could not, follow it, as even if they had signed it. There was no penalties for not following it. But the goal of GATT, the goal of the establishment of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, was to encourage rapid global economic growth after this devastating war. Unfortunately, because the pressure was on to increase global economic growth, this intensified pressure on small-scale economies. So now you started to have, even within the United Nations, within its charter, it talks about how tribal peoples needed to be forced into development because this was all part of, this rapid global economic growth, and that they needed to have the help of the more developed nations in order to come into the modern day economy. Notice this was nothing about going and asking, Indigenous nations, do you want to be a part of the global economy? Notice that this was assuming that the so-called developed world had, advanced ideas about how to exist as a human being. And please notice that the phrasing has shifted from what the old colonial rhetoric used to be, which used to be about, heathens and needing to Christianize the heathens, and used to be about the savages needing to be civilized. Now it's about the so-called undeveloped world, or, undeveloped world needing to become developed, and part of the development, part of they've started dividing the world up into the first world and third world, and there's a whole second world that, we won't go into here now, but it's interesting aside. But the first world and third world, the developed and the so-called undeveloped, this is where all of this came from. So the rhetoric of colonization shifts at this point from being heathen Christian, heathens need to be Christianized, savages need to be civilized, to the undeveloped needing to be developed. The World Bank. The World Bank has proven to be quite the problematic institution for Indigenous peoples, primarily because its stated goal is to alleviate poverty in the world. And how it goes about doing that is funding industrial projects such as mega hydro dams, or the building of infrastructure like building roads through, the Amazon forest, or building oil infrastructure, or giving loans for, resource extraction projects. So these loans go from the so-called developed world to the so-called undeveloped world, the first world to the so-called third world. And these loans are actually function very similarly to the debt peonage system that we discussed in the previous parts of this lecture. So it is really an attempt on the World Bank and the so-called first world to, one, open up the so-called third world to resource extraction, and that so-called third world consists of many Indigenous peoples around the world who live on beautifully undeveloped lands in terms of resource extraction. And it's a way, excuse me, it's also a way for the so-called first world to gain control of the so-called third world as it is opening up those industrially undeveloped lands. Such a similar process that has happened with Indigenous peoples throughout colonization. And if you imagine that process and then you put it in the context of first world versus third world, and you have a really good understanding in a general sense of what's happening with things like the World Bank. So the World Bank was founded, like I said, at that 1947 Bretton Woods Agreement. The big thing with the World Bank is that when it gives out loans to these so-called third world countries, it gives out loans that come with SAPs attached, structural adjustment programs. So essentially, it gives out loans with strings attached. And before I get into some specifics of what those SAPs involve, it's kind of like if you went in to get a loan from your bank or credit union for a car, and when you go into that bank for that, they say, well, sure, we'll give you a loan, but first you have to accept these conditions. You have to shop at only a certain store. You need to allow such and such a company to come onto your land and log the forest that you have there, and you need to stop, supporting some family member that you're helping out through a hard, difficult time. So the World Bank will oppose similar kind of structural adjustment programs as part of the conditions of giving a loan to a so-called third world country. But their structural adjustment programs look something like this. A couple of examples. One, common SAPs attached to these World Bank loans include requiring the country accepting the loan to allow full entry of foreign investment capital foreign multinational corporations and the expropriation of profits. So what does that mean? It means that the World Bank says if you're going to take this loan, one of the common SAPs that they attach to it is that that country must allow foreign corporations to come into their country and to allow those foreign corporations to take all of their profits, even up to 100% of their profits, to not leave any of their profits behind with the country that is allowing them in. So say it was Brazil that took this structural adjustment program, the World Bank might make a provision that they have to allow multinational companies to come in and drill oil in part of the Amazon. And so these multinational companies can come in, drill oil, and then the World Bank Structural Adjustment Program may require that Brazil does not like put any taxes on the profits of that company or require the company to return anything back to the local community. Instead, the World Bank says you have to allow the company to take as much of its profits out of your country as it wants to. Crazy stuff, right? Okay, so that's one example of a common SAP that's often attached to these loans. Another is that countries are required to cut social spending. So if they have a really good healthcare system, and it's surprising, a lot of people don't realize so-called undeveloped countries have some really great healthcare systems for their people. Their people don't have to worry about getting access to healthcare. And so the World Bank will come in and say, well, you have to cut funding for this health system because it's too expensive and we want to make sure that you're going to be able to pay back this loan. That's one example. Third structural adjustment program that's often attached to these loans is that countries accepting the loans, the World Bank will require them to remove supports that favor local economies, local industries, local products. So say you have small farmers who are trying to compete, trying to sell their products on the market, but these multinational corporations are able to offer the same produce at much cheaper prices because maybe they're genetically engineered, and of course they're producing it at vast quantities, and they're using synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, but these local farmers are growing organically and trying to grow healthy food, and that's it costs to do that, and they don't have the resources or the scale of the multinational corporations. So countries have put on like tariffs for foreign crops coming in to say, well, if you're going to purchase this corn from a multinational corporate source, then you're going to be paying more money than you would if you bought it from your local farmer. The World Bank says you have to get rid of those supports for local farmers, right? You have to get rid of supports for local economies, local industries, local products. A fourth structural adjustment programs that's commonly attached to these World Bank loans is that the World Bank requires the country accepting the loan to give corporations the status of persons. That is, they recognize corporations as having legal personhood, which is something we did in the United States through a Supreme Court decision back in the late 1800s. So this means that then corporations have all the rights that a human being has. And this becomes a very serious legal problem because you essentially come up with situations where you might have Indigenous people saying, well, you're violating our human rights. And the corporation says, well, you're violating our human rights if you're going to require us to do X, Y, Z, right? So you can have these conflicts where suddenly human rights becomes almost, I don't want to say meaningless, but legally meaningless because the corporation can also claim those same sort of rights to have the rights of personhood. And please note, the World Bank does not require these countries accepting these loans ever. This has never happened in the history of the World Bank that they require the countries accepting the loans to recognize the rights of personhood or the rights of beinghood of other beings, right? Of the land, of the forest, of the rivers, of the streams. That's never something that the World Bank has ever done. That'd be an interesting SAP. In fact, that should be attached to loans given to developed countries if there's such an institution. Anyway, I digress. A fifth structural adjustment program that's often attached is that government services must be privatized. So this might mean if the government is providing water, then the government now must stop providing water to its people and allow a multinational corporation to come in and provide the water. And this happened one place in Cochabamba, Bolivia, where a loan was accepted. Bolivia, or the city, I can't remember which of the city of Cochabamba might have been, accepted the loan. They were then required to privatize their services. It became so expensive. The people who lived there, who were very economically poor, could not afford the water, so they started collecting rainwater, and the corporation forbid them, the city supporting them because of this bank loan, forbid them from collecting rainwater So people had riots in the streets, and they said, no, absolutely, we won't allow this. So they actually were able to kick that structural adjustment program right out of their local community. But just one example of privatizing government services. And finally, an interesting thing, the Common Structural Adjustment Program attached to these loans is that the World Bank would require the country accepting the loan to increase its interest that it charges for credit to citizens. Increase the interest it charges for credit to citizens. And I'd really like to point out here that there are entire countries in the world that believe to charge interest on a loan is a sin. And I'm talking about the Muslim countries, the countries who are by and large based on the religion of Islam. It's a sin in Islam. It's a sin in Christianity too, to charge interest. But so a lot of, if you go over to the Mideast, a lot of those Muslim countries do not charge interest on loans. That's my understanding. So the World Bank, when it's giving these loans to third world countries, one of its common saps is to say you must increase, and if you're giving it to a country that doesn't have interest at all, you must start charging the interest that you give for credit, that you give on credit to your citizens. So those are just a couple of ways that the World Bank really tries to get in and get control of these so-called third world countries. Essentially, the whole idea in its quote-unquote mission, or its mission to quote-unquote alleviate poverty in the world, what it means by that is to open up so-called third world economies to multinational corporations. I want to read a quote to you from Anuradha Mittal, who was the former director of, the former co-director of the Institute for Food and Development Policy, better known as Food First. And she comes from India. She says, she gives an example. She said, if we're talking about India, she says, after India gained independence, the Western powers once again found a way to colonize the country, first through the World Bank, and now through what I call the unholy trinity of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization, institutions we'll talk about in a minute. Third world countries were and are given bad loans that people did not and do not want, loans about which we have never been consulted, loans for projects such as large dams that we protested and continue to protest, loans for unpopular projects have been made to U.S.-backed dictators in the Philippines, Indonesia, Uganda. The World Bank gave the Philippines a loan to build a nuclear reactor in an area prone to seismic activity. She says, and despite the fact that the World Bank gives loans to even brutal dictators, the people have been forced to pay them back, thus continuing the repression that these dictators have started. In country after country, the money has been funneled through the puppet governments and returned to the Western transnationals, all on the bent backs of the poor. Meanwhile, the poor nations have been compelled to slash their health and education programs, privatize the service sector, and cut down on jobs traditionally filled by women. Nurses, primary teachers, who needs them? Get rid of them. Says it's time to give people in the third world their fair due. It's time for reparations now. And what she's talking about there, she said, we often have people talking about how we need to forgive third world debt, and that's a good point. But she says it's more than that. It's more than making us stop paying. So much damage has been caused to the third world through these international financial institutions like the World Bank that it's way beyond just saying, okay, of course, we see what a corrupt system has put the third world into tremendous debt. We see, she says, we want you to recognize too what destruction this corrupt system has done to the so-called third world, and we want to have reparations made so that we can get back to a healthy land and healthy people, because the so-called first world and its multinational corporations have made so much wealth and money on the backs of the poor in the so-called third world. The International Monetary Fund is kind of a joint partner in some ways, is how I see it, of the World Bank. The World Bank tends to give projects or loans for long-term projects, and the International Monetary Fund gives loans for short-term projects, usually and in having to address emergency situations such as the devastation caused by a hurricane. And they do the same things. The World Bank have their structural adjustment programs and so on and so forth. So the so-called third world has become tangled in this system of debt and great financial difficulty for its people, all because of the first world wanting to open up these relatively industrially undeveloped countries to multinational corporations' industrial development. That goes back to benefiting the so-called first world. And, in the end, the first world and its multinational corporations are the ones who benefit. All right. So one example of a major international finance institution having all this power and, of course, using euphemistic slogans like "we are out there to alleviate poverty," when in fact what they mean is we are out there to industrially develop the world and help our multinational corporations and thus the so-called first world countries profit from this industrial development.